This is a paper that estimates COVID concentration in the air with carbon dioxide levels. So, carbon dioxide is used as a surrogate for an infection risk of COVID. In this paper, they show that COVID is very stable within the air when it's aerosolized at 800 parts per million carbon dioxide and greater. And interestingly, they show that the level of carbon dioxide in the air has a more profound impact on the stability of COVID in the air than humidity does. So, this should be a third point of consideration when doing COVID air studies. We should be looking at temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide concentration of the air. And one of the interesting points right off the bat is that 800 parts per million is not a lot. Aranet says that anything under 1,000 parts per million is healthy air, and that means that when we consider good air, a lot of times it's not good in terms of COVID stability. It means that there's a pretty high risk of catching COVID when you have anything that's 800 or higher. So this is a very stringent standard to be setting air to be below 800 parts per million. So, since 2020, CO2 monitors have become commonly used as an indicator for potential COVID transmission, as CO2 levels can serve as a proxy for overall ventilation efficiency and thus can be a predictor for total aerosol viral load. Now, in poorly ventilated spaces, highly occupied spaces, and indoor spaces, the carbon dioxide levels of that environment can commonly reach concentrations exceeding 2,000 parts per million, which is troubling because anything over 1,400 parts per million has about a 50% decrease in brain cognitive functioning. And even more concerningly, in crowded environments, the levels of carbon dioxide can reach greater than 5,000 parts per million. The first finding of the paper is that when compared to typical atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, which is around 500 parts per million, typically around 450, but for this study they said 500, increasing the carbon dioxide levels to just 800 parts per million results in a significant increase in viral aerostability after 2 minutes. Even more interestingly, there was no significant difference in infectivity between 800 parts per million and 6,500 parts per million, meaning that it's very important to keep it below that 800 threshold. So here's that data at 0 parts per million, 500, 800, all the way up to 6,000. So with our Delta variant, we have the most data. And when it's 500 or lower, it's staying very low in infectivity, relatively low in infectivity. But once we hit that 800 parts per million threshold, it's not statistically significantly different between the higher levels. And we see a similar trend for both beta and Omicron. And since we saw the same thing for 3 different COVID variants, it's highly suggestive that the COVID concentration is a highly influential factor on aerosolized stability of COVID. However, the stability of each variant is going to be different. For instance, Delta and Beta coronavirus had a pretty significant jump, but Omicron didn't have as high of a difference in aerosolized stability. And what's really interesting, so we have the gray at 500 parts per million, we have the red at 3,000, and the blue at 6,000. And you can see that there's that U curve for relative humidity. As we're changing humidity, we have increasing levels of infectivity at the high range, and then at the low range, they didn't test the low range, but we know that as a standard principle for COVID. And we see that there's an upshift in infectivity at the higher levels of carbon dioxide, a very significant upshift, which means that even with good ventilation, the probability of onward transmission doubles when you have very high levels of carbon dioxide versus lower levels of carbon dioxide in the environment. So it's not just cleaning the air, you also have to be able to refresh the air, turn over the air in the environment. Additionally, from this study, they found that COVID has a triphasic decay profile. This one is just for the science girlies. So there's a lag phase where you don't have any change in infectivity early on, and then they hit a point where it hits a dynamic decay phase and then the slow decay phase, which is very important because a lot of models consider that right when COVID is ejected, it immediately starts to die off and then hit a slow decay phase, which isn't true. It actually lags for a period of time and holds its infectivity, and then at a certain point, it does a dynamic decay and then followed by a slow decay, which takes much longer.